Hello and welcome to the Wilderness Issues Lecture Series. This is our keynote address for the series focused on Native peoples and conservation. So my name is Nikki Fear and I'm one of the coordinators for the series along with Lori Ashley over there. And we both work for the Wilderness Institute. The Wilderness Institute sponsors this series and we're now in our 27th year. And the Wilderness Institute is part of the College of Forestry and Conservation here at the University of Montana. So we're fortunate for this series to have many dynamic and progressive leaders to address this topic of Native peoples and conservation. Speakers are coming from all around the country, and they include leaders in tribal land management, in environmental and human rights advocacy, in natural resource law, in Indian education, in the arts. And we're going to hear about a lot of different perspectives about historic and contemporary practices, present day land use conflicts, and new efforts that incorporate both traditional and modern notions of conservation. So tonight we have Dennis Martinez here, who's one of the nation's leaders in conservation, and he's going to kick off our series. Jeffrey Ross is going to be introducing him, but first, before we do that, I just have a few announcements and thanks to give. This series has been supported by a lot of different people, and we've had many generous donations. And I want to just give thanks to and recognition to a few of those. First of all, the art for the series that some of you may have seen was donated by the Montana Museum of Art and Culture. This image on the series poster was done by a woman named Gloria Emerson from the Dene Nation. And then we'll have artwork on all the individual flyers for particular speakers. This one for Dennis Martinez was done by a man named James Creel. And there have been many other people who have donated to this series. This particular talk was coordinated through the chapter of the American Indian Science and Engineering Society, more popularly known as ACES. And Jeffrey Ross is the student president. And he had the brilliant idea of inviting and then coordinating Dennis Martinez's visit and came up with all the funding for the visit. He's worked with the Salish and Kootenai College. He worked with the Diversity Advisory Council, and he worked with the UM's Native American Natural Resource Program, and coordinated a visit with high school students yesterday that Dennis Martinez spoke with. And then Dennis went today up to the Salish and Kootenai College too. So thank you, Jeffrey, for that. I also want to note that the MCAT, the Montana Community Access Television, our local public television broadcasting station, and also KUFM, our public radio station, are recording this series tonight, and it's for future audiences. Jeffrey Ross is going to be further introducing Dennis Martinez. Thank you, Jeffrey.
All right, before I begin, I have to give credit to Connie Flores, who is the treasurer of ACES, because when Nikki approached us about inviting potential speakers for this series, I asked Connie who she thought, and she recommended Dennis Martinez. So thanks, Connie, for that. So as Nikki said, tonight's lecture is brought to you by the American Indian Science and Engineering Society, or ACES. ACES is a national nonprofit organization which nurtures building of community by bridging science and technology with Native traditional values. ACES was founded by American Indian scientists, engineers, and educators to address the high dropout rates, low college enrollment and graduation rates, and the underrepresentation of American Indians in science fields compared to other ethnic groups in the United States. It is the goal of ACES to identify and remove barriers to academic success for Native students by providing peer support, mentoring, leadership opportunities, and career guidance. I know Nikki had mentioned some of the people we'd like to thank, but we'd like to follow the following organizations for their financial support, because without it, tonight's lecture would not have been possible. So that was the Diversity Advisory Council, the College of Forestry and Conservation, the Salish Kootenai College, the Department of Native American Studies, and Project Train. I also want to send a special thank you to the students of the Wilderness and Civilization program, particularly Beth Ann Garamond, Jen Meyer, Angie Jones, Liz Lamb, Ellen Burns, and Ivy Baker, who are responsible for this year's lecture series. Without their collective vision, this series would not have been possible. And now, to introduce our speaker, and hopefully I'll get his name right, because yesterday at the luncheon I called him Douglas, George, and everything else but his real name. Mr. Dennis Martinez is of Otam, Chicano, Anglo heritage, and practices traditional Native American values and traditions. He has 36 years of experience in environmental landscaping and restoration, and has been building bridges between indigenous traditional ecological knowledge and Western science. It is his hope that with increased scientific understanding of the present frailty of indigenous cultural survival and the critical role of those same cultures in protecting biodiversity through sustainable cultural practices, Western environmental organizations will acknowledge indigenous cultural rights and support traditional management regimes instead of advocating the removal of Native peoples from their homelands in the name of pure scientific research and conservation of natural areas. Mr. Martinez is founder and chair of the Indigenous Peoples Restoration Network, a working group for the Society of Ecological Restoration International. His activities have centered around organizing international Indigenous conferences, promoting Indigenous participation in the meetings of scientific societies like the Ecological Society of America. His work to influence local, regional, and national forest management policies in order to open doors previously closed to Indigenous access to cultural resources and protection of sacred sites. Mr. Martinez is also co-director of the Takelma Intertribal Project, which has been negotiating with the Rogue River National Forest and the Siletz Confederated Indian Tribes to establish a Native American demonstration site for the restoration of pre-contact cultural landscapes of the Takelma Indians who were relocated to Siletz in 1855. Representing TIP, Mr. Martinez is a member of the Applegate Fuels Reduction Management Demonstration Project in Southwest Oregon, which is a coalition of industry, environmental, and community representatives. In 2005, after 13 years of negotiation, this working group succeeded in gaining access to the Rogue River National Forest lands for a Native American restoration demonstration site with which to compare traditional Indian forest management practices, especially anthropogenic fire, against conventional agency approaches to fuels fire hazard reduction, and to study through ecological monitoring how to successfully integrate fuels reduction with ecological restoration. Mr. Martinez has several memberships on various boards and advisory bodies. He has served for the Society of Ecological Restoration International. He's served on the long-term traditional ecological knowledge study section for the ESA. He's been on the Traditional Knowledge Council of the American Indian Science and Engineering Society, the Cultural Conservancy Eco-Forestry Institute, US. He has published several books and has been published in several journals. A couple that I'll mention is he's written one article, Protected Areas, Indigenous Peoples and the Western Idea of Nature and Ecological Restoration, and he's also just published the Educator's Guide to American Indian Perspective and Natural Resources, which he co-authored with Frank Lake. He's received several awards, including the Society of Ecological Restoration International's John Rieger Service Award in Ecological Restoration, 2 fellowships from the Bioneers Collective Heritage Institute for Environmental Justice, and has been noted in the Biography of American Environmental Leaders. So I'd just like to introduce Mr. Martinez.
I'm partially dyslexic, so I may screw this up a little bit between right and left. I can follow complex thoughts, but I have trouble with simple right and lefts. So left is back, right is forward. Okay. I want to sincerely apologize. Can you everyone hear me up in the back? Good. Okay. I want to apologize for those of you who probably with great difficulty, forewent George Bush's State of the Nation presentation tonight. You can catch it on CNN later when you get home. Thank you. I've been working in this field for quite a few years, and I think even 10 or 15 years ago, probably wouldn't have had indigenous issues presented in a wilderness conference of any kind. I know because I've worked hard over the years trying to integrate indigenous presenters into the Society for Conservation Biology and the Ecological Society of America and the Society for Ecological Restoration International and other scientific groups. It's been a long time coming where some recognition has finally been given by Western scientists to the importance of traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK for short. Working with the Forest Service in just one situation in Oregon, Rogue River National Forest, for 12, 13 years, just to get a few hundred acres of area on public lands for a Native American cultural landscape restoration demo area has not been easy. We've gone through one supervisor and one ranger after another. Some support us, some don't. Somebody's on the career trajectory, so they're supported, but they leave after a year. They go to Alaska or North Carolina, and we start educating the teams all over again. This is very much like the old treaty negotiation process. You think you got them on your side, and maybe you got one or two supporting you, and then they leave. You start all over again. But we were able to bring back, after a 150-year absence, the first right salmon homecoming ceremony on the Applegate River, Takelma ancestral lands, Andakubiteti ancestral lands in southwest Oregon in the Applegate watershed. And we started that back in 1994 with Agnes Pilgrim, my co-director, who's the oldest living Takelma descendant from Siletz Confederated Tribes Reservation, Newport, Oregon. And I work a lot as a liaison between U.S. public lands agencies and Native access to their cultural resources that have become lands that were ceded to those agencies a long time ago, and from which Native people in many regions of this country have been blocked from access in managing their cultural resources. And that has been another uphill battle. And it's been an uphill battle to get some recognition internationally of indigenous efforts to maintain their presence in their own homelands, to contribute to the conservation of endangered species and ecosystems, but it's beginning to happen. Maybe the last 10 years at the most, we've seen a change in at least a minority of scientists in accepting that, yes, Indian people, while living mostly passively on the land, taking nothing but photographs and leaving nothing but footprints, the noble savage, actually may have had, at least in some elevations, in some ecosystems, some impact on ecosystem structure, composition, and function. That's been encouraging. It's been a difficult row to hoe for a long time, and a lot of people have put a lot of their time and effort and energy into trying to make this happen. Having a long-term study section in ESA, the last 2 years, we began the process 5 years ago, Snowbird, Utah, at their annual meeting, has been very, very gratifying. And what I want to talk about tonight is why it is important to recognize indigenous contributions, both past and present, to saving endangered species and habitats, and why it's important that they be included as co-managers of lands that they've lost to U.S. public lands agencies and many other nation states around the world. where we're in contact with indigenous struggles there as well. We'll take a broad brush approach, give a little context, internationally and regionally and locally, of some of the important points about indigenous management or cultural land practices. Management is a damn poor word to describe what I'm trying to describe. It's an English word that we're stuck with. Management implies some mastery over domination of nature. And that's not what we're talking about. And that's the point often misunderstood. But we'll get a little more into that and show you what the spiritual relationships are between indigenous peoples and the lands that they come from. So, this was a PowerPoint that I gave in Zaragoza, Spain in September that's been pared down for a 1-hour presentation, so I'm going to move kind of fast. And at that meeting, we had 50 indigenous scholars and activists from all over the world, every continent and all the oceans, the Arctic, the Andes, Himalayas, Africa, Kenya, Zimbabwe, Central Asia, China, Soviet, Russian Siberia, Sami, the Arctic North in Canada, in Alaska. And these people told stories of the effects of global warming on their lifestyles. And I thought I knew something about how dire the situation was in the future coming up for effects of global warming, but I had no idea until I heard these stories by native peoples just how much they're being impacted now by global climate change. Entire lifestyles and ways of living, hunting, fishing, predicting weather patterns, herding, and so on. All of these indigenous peoples are being severely impacted by global climate change. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the course of this presentation. What are, or who are indigenous peoples? And you notice there's an apostrophe after the S. That's a very important point. The word indigenous started being used by the Canadian Indian Brotherhood and the American Indian Movement, AIM, in the 70s as a way to internationalize those local struggles against assimilation and colonialism. And it's grown because we have been meeting with each other in conferences all over the world now for some years. Indigenous peoples are peoples that live in landscapes that are imbued with cultural meaning and spiritual meaning. Rocks, peaks, rivers, springs, streams, wetlands, ponds. These are all places where there's stories about how the people lived a long time ago when human beings could talk to animals and animals could talk to human beings. These are stories that teach us lessons on how to live. This is called the sacred geography of ancestral lands. And when people are forced out of their homelands, when they're forced to leave, even when they're doing ecologically appropriate cultural land practices, this is an incredibly difficult impact psychologically and ecologically, because people's identities are tied up with those lands. And they're being relocated, according to Western scientists, in order for them to study these ecosystems in their, quote, pure form. The message that I have tonight is there are no pure forms in nature. Human activities, for better or for worse, have affected every kind of habitat type and ecosystem on this planet. And because we look back on the 20th century as an almost unbelievable, destructive century of human beings and of nature, that we naturally have almost a visceral reaction against the idea that human beings have any capacity for managing those lands in a sustainable way. That's very understandable. But we need not get stuck there. I can relate to that really well. But culture does matter, not just because we're human beings and innately destructive or innately rapacious or greedy. Cultures make us that way. Economic systems make us that way. And unfortunately, we don't read in the newspapers or hear in the television or radio all of the good things being done by tribal and other indigenous peoples globally to resist that assimilation, resist globalization, and promote their own local ways of understanding and working with the land. Those are who indigenous peoples are. There's over 5,000 languages spoken in this world. 600 million indigenous peoples, 10 to 15% of the world's population. They account for 95% of the world's cultural diversity. And global hotspots, according to World Wildlife Fund and IUCN, are located on indigenous ancestral lands where these people currently live. Of the 6,000 languages spoken that we're aware of, 8 million, 10,000 people, 8 speakers or less, communities of 10,000 speakers of their native language or less, which is 8 million people or 0.2% of the world's population. And of that, half of those languages are spoken by 1,000 or fewer speakers. In many cases, it's down to 3 and 4 and 5 and 10, 15 speakers. This is an incredible loss because those languages, which are place-based and ancient, embody and encode much ecological information about their homelands, about the ecosystems that they live in. And when those languages are lost, that knowledge is lost forever. Traditional ecological knowledge is a living library that lives in the hearts of people. It's not been written down except by scientists who study those peoples. And there's much more not written down than is written down. And when those people lose their lands and when they lose their languages, become assimilated into the dominant culture's economic systems, whether it's communist, capitalist, or socialist, it doesn't matter. It's a top-down Euro approach to managing people. They suffer. Their children suffer trying to live in two different worlds. One world that says what they know, who they are, is valueless in this world, and another world that says hang on to your culture, hang on to your identity, hang on to your traditional knowledge, and survive. That's the battleground. And in no small part plays a role in the incredibly high suicide rates of Indian youth and indigenous youth around this world. Those countries in black are places where they have the most linguistic diversity coupled with the most vertebrate mammal diversity. The gray areas, I know it's hard to see, categorize either linguistic diversity or mammal vertebrate diversity. And as you can see, there's only a few places where we have both. And within those dark areas exist the biological hotspots that I mentioned earlier. Extinction of experience is what linguistic extinction means. Loss of identity. Now, what is traditional ecological knowledge? My definition, and I drew on Furcus Burkett, University of Saskatchewan, he's a Swedish scholar, studies indigenous systems, as a local place-based belief, knowledge, practice complex. And it encompasses a lot of knowledge of many kinds. but one of pre-modern lineage that is capable of adapting to changing environmental conditions without sacrificing time-honored cosmologies, beliefs, and principles of environmental management. Indigenous peoples, above all, understand that the systems they live in change constantly. And there wasn't a time not so long ago that Western science had embraced homeostasis, the idea that natural systems automatically rebalance to optimum function if left alone. Ecologists abandoned that paradigm over 50 years ago, but unfortunately it still exists in the minds of many people within Western environmental movements. There is a tipping point in ecological degradation where human intervention becomes necessary. And if for no other moral reason than that we've caused this destruction and we have a responsibility to make it right the best way we know how. And the only way you do that is by doing it. We have a lot of armchair philosophers in academia who throw stones at people who do ecological restoration, and especially those people who incorporate indigenous knowledge systems into that restoration and building reference ecosystems for what to restore back to, who have never even been in indigenous community. They don't have a clue as to what really has been going on, because much of this material is not published. Most ecologists, resource managers, foresters, silviculturists, and so on don't read ethnography, they don't read anthropology, they don't read ethnoecology. And when science marginalizes or ignores that knowledge, they're basing that action on stone ignorance. They simply don't know what they're talking about. And we run into this all the time. Western science is purported to be a value-free epistemology, a way of knowing the world. And in fact, both TEK and Western ecological science, WES, are conditioned heavily by the cultural context out of which they arise. My academic field of study was the history and philosophy of Western science. And we learn by studying how science actually develops, not the textbook, page 1, man's knowledge ever increasing. We have now accumulated knowledge and we're ever advancing and progressing to a higher point in civilization. Rather, it's been a very uneven process. It's been an uneven process that has drawn on the experience of people who are either artisans, craftspeople, indigenous land managers, herders, and so on. Linnaeus, binomial classification for plants and animals. I wonder how many people in this audience know that is not Linnaeus's original concept. He did not come up with it. He borrowed it from the Sami people of northern Scandinavia. My specialty in science was Darwinian evolution. And when you study how Darwin came about discovering natural selection as a mechanism for evolution, you find that he often, in the beginning, talked to plant breeders and animal breeders, and it began to make him aware of selection. And we was in the Galapagos Islands, of course, he put 2 and 2 together. He was a very honest man, above all else, and he had a lot of money to do this. And he came up with natural selection. But he dared not publish that for another almost 30 years. But he drew on ordinary local people to get the idea for natural selection. Galileo, theoretical physics and astronomy, went to the people that worked in the arsenals, ballistics arsenals in Venice, and that's where he began to get his ideas. 25% of all prescriptions contain some plant material that was based on indigenous selection and methods of processing, and methods of mixing different plants together to make medicine. And now we see the bioprospecting by multinational pharmaceutical companies that are literally ripping off that knowledge rapidly without any compensation or even prior consent from indigenous people. And since World War II, slowly, many scientists in a variety of disciplines have realized that some of the systems of agroecology, agroforestry, permaculture, crop rotations, pest and soil management, and so on, have provided insights into modern agriculture, the biotechnology craze notwithstanding. What is good for indigenous cultures where people still practice the traditional ways is good for the land. And what is good for the land is also good for the people. Governments in nation states own wildlife. They charge fees for licenses. Globalization is encouraging monocultures of pine and eucalyptus plantations and other crops which rely on external oil-based inputs, leading to poor nutrition of the people. And this is a major issue, the health of the people that no longer have the traditional diets. There's studies being done now, for example, of people that live in salmon country where I'm from, like the Karuk tribe I work with near where I live in northwestern California, where they're documenting the ill health effects of the loss of salmon, or the work that Native Seed Search and other indigenous organizations in the greater Southwest have done with the problem of obesity and diabetes, trying to get people off of USDA commodities like white flour, white sugar, and lard. You know, fry bread is good, but it's also pure poison. You don't want to eat it every day. Getting people back to chia seeds and to mesquite flour and to prickly pear pads and the wild plants that people used to rely on for their diet. This is happening now. It's beginning to happen. And this is lowering the incidence of diabetes, especially adult onset diabetes among the O'odham, my grandmother's people, and the Tona O'odham, who have the highest rate of adult onset diabetes in the world. When you're born, you have a 50% chance of getting that by age 35. We're seeing it now in even young children. So the health of the land is important. We have International Monetary Fund, World Bank, bilateral loans of all kinds, resulting in debt of the elites of nation states, newly emerging third world countries around the world, where they have to go into monocultures to develop the hard currency to pay off the debts, and then force, this is happening everywhere, force people then to adapt to a way of life and an economic system that destroys an incredible diversity of the plants and animals that they depended on for subsistence. This has led to an incredible loss of biodiversity. Prohibition of intentional fire, which was a major management tool here in North America, in Australia, in Asia, in Africa, many places, has led to tremendous losses in biodiversity and ecological degradation. It's led to the closing up of savannas and open woodlands, the choking of exotic weeds in wetlands, and many other systems. Now, Yellowstone is close to here. I want to talk a little bit about that. It's an example. It's called the Yellowstone model that has been exported around the world since 1872 as a way of setting aside reserves, protected areas, in order to conserve wildlife, conserve the ecological integrity of these protected areas, allow scientific research to happen, allow recreation and tourism to develop, all those kinds of things. My adopted mother, whose crow kicked in the belly band, remembers when people used to go to Yellowstone in the summertime, go up in the high country. The Bannock Shoshone sheep eaters lived there all year long. Blackfoot, other Shoshone tribes used to go there quite a lot. You pick up a brochure at the park and they say Native peoples were the first visitors. They lived there. They hunted the mountain sheep. They hunted elk and deer in the summertime. They had ceremonies. They had vision quests. This place was heavily utilized. Yet for years and years and years, Yellowstone said, no, Indians were afraid of the geysers. They didn't dare come in the park. This is complete nonsense. They did, and they were forced out. And they burned when they were there. They burned a heck of a lot. We had the 1988, 87 is wrong, 1988 Yellowstone fire. Now, it was roughly on a stand replacing fire cycle, but it took out a greater amount of forest, and it took out it more intensely because of the fuel buildup that had happened since Indian removal. So you have a situation where we look at lodgepole pine seedlings coming up. It's all green, and that's great. But sometimes we forget that 15% of that land area, the soils were sterilized. And it takes hundreds of years for those soils to come back because of the fuel loading. That was outside the historical range of variability, outside what that ecosystem is familiar with over millennia, what it co-evolved with. Worse yet, and I know some of you at least know about the white bark pine communities and the difficulties they're having, and the threat to Clark's nutcracker, the threat to the pine, the threat to grizzly bears who need that for hibernation, especially females whose fertilized ova will not implant on the wall of the uterus in the grizzly bear female unless she has sufficient quantities of white bark pine seeds. Well, that community used to go down into the lower subalpine areas in Yellowstone, as it has in other parts of the northern Rockies. It went way down to the lodgepole pine belt. And when those seedlings from the lodgepole pine came up, they came up the following spring and summer. But there was an incredibly good massed pine cone production in 1989. But because there's delayed germination in white bark pine, it successively germinated over 1989, 1990, 1991, which gave the lodgepole pine an incredibly good jump ahead of the establishment of the white bark seedlings. So that we didn't have the kind of effect that happened historically, where you had a burn and Clark's nutcrackers stashed those seeds up to 82 they carry in their esophagus at one time, and plant them all over in groups so that you have a clumped kind of architecture of the white bark pine. And those trees have shrank to the higher elevations. And one major reason for that, of course, is white pine blister rust, which is doing better in moister, lower elevation environments than it is in harsher, more arid, drier, upper elevation portions of the subalpine range. So we have a situation where fires that used to be relatively less severe, that is, there were fewer lethal surface fires which scorch-killed the overstory trees, is no longer happening. When they do happen, major conflagrations that come and burn too hot. And the accelerated succession process for more shade-tolerant conifers like Engelmann spruce and for subalpine fir have taken over what was former white bark pine habitat. And so between the accelerated succession, the mountain pine beetle from decadent lodgepole stands that should have burned 30 years ago, that came from the great fires of 1910, and the white pine blister rust, has put the white bark pine community in peril. It's an extremely difficult problem to solve because we don't put those fires out at lower elevations because that's where humans are. But without those fires that go from lower elevation of the right intensity, the right severity, up to higher ones, we're going to lose, especially with global warming, a fourth factor in this, a lot of our white bark pine community, and that's going to directly affect Clark's nutcrackers and affect grizzly bear habitat. Other places we've had similar problems when Indian people have been prevented from practicing their traditional ways, or from nation-state governments have exploited their traditional resources. The case of Mosquito Indians in Nicaragua and Honduras that used to harvest sea turtles, and sometimes people say, look, they over-harvested the sea turtles. They didn't. That was Somoza's government, and later the Sandinistas that impacted sea turtles. And now they just do lobster. The ocean fishing is poor, and the sea turtles are almost gone. So these are the kinds of problems that develop in an attempt to assimilate indigenous peoples, whether it's a socialist, communist system or whether it's a capitalist system. It doesn't really matter a whole hell of a lot. Sahel. Land tenure, secure land tenure, and the ability to regulate your herding animals traditionally. So you had knowledge specialists and elders that knew when and where to go with the animals, was destroyed by the process of switching to monoculture, switching to projects like hydroelectric, switching to all kinds of things that benefited the elites of those nation states, that generated the hard currency to pay back World Bank debts and so on, totally disrupting the lifestyles of the nomads of that area. Somalia, Eritrea, remember the starvation time? How these people looked in the 1970s? It was really, really pathetic. That was not just a drought. That was a drought plus misplaced World Bank projects. Under communism, 70 years destroyed the regulatory structure of herders in Mongolia, in China, in Russia. The Chinese and Russians actually plowed up relatively pristine grasslands that were grazed for centuries, even millennia, in order to industrialize rapidly, develop what we call modern economic practices. In Yosemite National Park, the Awinichi Band of Miwok Indians were relocated when John Muir helped establish that park. And the only way they could live in that park is if they worked there. The last Miwok Indian of the Awinichi Band to live there was in 1995, 94. Remember the floods of 1995, January 1? The elders had predicted that the rocks would fall down when the last Indian left that area, Yosemite Valley, and in fact they did. That was the 1,000-year flood event. When they went back to collect acorns and burn under the oak trees, black oak, they were prevented from doing that by park authorities. And John Muir himself said that they had no business messing with that environment because they were humans intruding on pristine nature. And he didn't have a very good attitude about California Indians. They used to dress them up like Plains Indians in Yosemite for the tourist pictures. Same in Glacier National Park, those great pictures of Indians in traditional regalia were posed for the tourists. They became caddies on golf courses, eventually had to leave, but the Blackfeet have resisted very well compared to other parks. Slash and burn agriculture has a very bad name all over the world. It was banned by the Dutch in Indonesia and Southeast Asia. It's been banned by every nation state since. And it's partly because the traditional ways of rest rotation swidden agriculture have been abandoned, and people have forgotten how to do the long-term rotational pattern that's very subtle in its effects in wet tropical systems, but which increase the biodiversity of those systems. Same in Australia, in a number of different vegetation types. Boreal forests, with the Cree or one jump ahead in the past, one jump ahead of the RCMP, trying to keep burning for their rejuvenation of animal habitat, muskrats and so on, have been prevented from doing that. And those fires that now come, they burn for months sometimes in peat, and that affects caribou and moose habitat. Savannas, wetlands, ridges and gaps in our temperate forest ecosystems around here, and so on, have all been affected. Why has Western science marginalized or ignored these kinds of practices that are well documented and where traditions still obtained to a large degree have been beneficial for natural systems? There's probably several reasons that's been the case. And it hasn't always been in Western philosophy that we've separated human beings from nature. $150 years at the most. Catlin, Marsh, Audubon, Thoreau, they all advocated parks for both wildlife, thank you, and native peoples. But that idea, beginning with Yellowstone, dropped by the wayside because people wanted to promote tourism, and Indians got in the way of that, especially at Yellowstone compared to Glacier and Yosemite and other parks. And scientists wanted to do pure scientific research. The separation of humans from nature also coincides with the growth of cities in Europe and North America, such that people no longer depended directly on their environments for much of the wherewithal of life, what sustained them, and began to appreciate the concept of wilderness, that nature without people. There's no indigenous word for wilderness. I mean, I'm the keynote speaker in a wilderness lecture series. I find that kind of ironic. Wild, yes. That which we don't control, both within ourselves and out there, that's wild. It has a vitality and a momentum of its own, and there's Indian words for that. My grandmother's word was doachkam in O'odham language. And that means something that's vital, that's healthy, that's untamed. And the Indian people and many tribes had different words for degrees of wildness and degrees of human domestication and so on. And there's a continuum. But wilderness, in the sense that human beings don't belong there, they only can recreate or have spiritual experiences there. They can't depend on those areas. We can't take care. The word that the elders use is caregiving. In Australia, they say land care. This is taking care of that which sustains you. Then there's the past environmental abuses by indigenous people. A lot of people get stuck on that. There's no noble savages. There's no people that are perfectly in accord with their environment. There's many degrees of living in harmony with the land. And not every individual was able to do that. Just like now, we espouse certain ideals, and yet we don't always reach those ideals. But overall, if people didn't pay attention to conserving those resources, rejuvenating habitat that wildlife depended on, and modifying plants that were useful culturally, say by fire, which could not be used in basketry or cordage or 15 other categories of cultural use, they would not have survived. That would have been the end of it. The evidence for megafauna extinctions is ambiguous, and I'd be the first one to say that if it happened, they must have learned a hard lesson. But I also would ask, Which tribe did it of the 800 in North America? And I'd ask, why do American scientists differ from those scientists in UK and Ukraine who don't put a lot of stock in megafauna extinction stemming from Paleo-Indians, from Paleo-Indigenous people? There's a lot of different national expressions of science that we're not even aware of in this debate. Mayans, Anasazi, Hawaiians exterminating flightless land birds probably happened. In the case of the Anasazi, it was a combination of climate change, as probably happened with the megafauna extinctions, and diminishing marginal returns of a society, and the same with the Mayan, and the same with the Aztecs, that stretched too far away from their own core values and changed over time to where they began to lose some of that ethic of conservation. And when I say ethics, I'm not talking about Western utilitarian ethics in the sense that we have natural capital and ecosystem services for people. I'm talking about a relationship that was basically spiritual between the animals, plants, and the human beings. And I'll talk a little bit more about that soon. Then there's the myth that nature was so bountiful in many places that people didn't have to do anything to survive. I challenge anyone to go out in the woods and live a year without fire. It'd be real hard, and you wouldn't survive. You need that burning to get the kinds of useful plant materials modified by fire in order to have a culture, to have an economy. Populations were low. Technology was unsophisticated. One Indian with one club could have wiped out the great auk in Newfoundland, which was exterminated by Europeans, or the cormorant, the Bering Sea cormorant, up in Alaska and Siberia, very easily. And it was a hot trade item, especially the great auk. They used every part of that bird. Bow and arrow was very effective. Alado was very effective against a number of large mammals like mastodon and so on. Population numbers are probably 10 times what is currently estimated by anthropologists because of European diseases to which native people had no immunity. We've had to revise those figures upward consistently. Then there's tribes today, like Alaska, native corporations in Alaska, like progressive band and tribal councils in Canada and the US, that, as in Canada, lease out a lot of their forest lands to Macmillan Blodells and other large corporate concerns. But what people don't know is that there's a significant number of people within those communities that oppose the loss of the traditional values in this race for fast-track economic development, who want to retain the traditional values, the core values, even while addressing the incredibly high unemployment rates in Indian communities, up to 90% in some places, and all of the other kinds of malaise. Frankly, 200 years of poverty has not worked for us. We need that kind of economic development. We need a kind of economic development that is respectful toward the land in the traditional ways. Did Indian people have an ethic? Were they the, quote, first ecologists or into conservation? Yes, but not in the same way that we see conservation exactly. And have scientists studied indigenous communities and traditional knowledge and how they manage their lands? It's not even on the radar screen. And then there's the focus, as Gary Nabhan has pointed out, on species extinctions as opposed to the heterogeneity of the habitat that is supportive of great species diversity. We have reserves and set-asides based on island biogeography theory that says that we can ascertain fairly accurately the area and the size of these reserves that will save endangered animals and plants. But in most cases, we're guessing. We're flat out guessing. It's a case of an incredible projection of anthropomorphism onto the natural world to assume, when we hardly know the life cycles of the average native plant, how we're going to save them with reserves unless we include what we call the matrix that surrounds those reserves, which has now become a timber sacrifice zone that needs to be looked at in a different way, in a way that says this is potential habitat or actual habitat, and because we're guessing, because we're so goddamn ignorant, we had better consider all of the land base, not just a few reserves, in our efforts in conservation. But what I do a lot in training forest workers and foresters about restoration is working with the concept of first focus on conservation and restoration. And the economics of that focus then become a byproduct of that effort, which is first conservation, restoration. And between restoration and conservation, the first priority is always conservation, because once a system is lost, once a wetland is lost, it will never ever be restored to exactly the way it used to be. But we can at least get the rough features of composition, structure, integrity, and function back into that system, provided that we allow enough land to be habitat and that we leave enough old growth, not only trees, but bunchgrass, prairie, shrubland, savanna, hardwoods, and so on, besides socially and economically valuable conifers like Douglas fir in that system, and that we log in a different way. And that's what I try to do. Technically, that is feasible. But we are locked into a situation where we've divided the world up into conservation and economic sacrifice areas. And that's what needs to change. The real issue is not indigenous ethics, whether Indians were first ecologists or not. That makes reputations for academics who are trying to burst this bubble of romanticism directed toward Native people, a construct that came out of the Enlightenment of the 18th century and for which no indigenous culture is responsible. That's a European idea. We never said that. Well, the real issue is the very foundations of science, the objective foundations of science. There's a lot of people who are either deep ecologists or conservation biologists that I've talked to and heard speak or read their papers who say that any time we spend, any energy we put into social justice, environmental justice, we're taken away from population growth problems and from conserving nature. And I say that you can't separate the two. If people are poor, they will violate their own traditional values to make a point or to live and save their kids and feed their children. It happens all over. You want to stop elephant poaching? Get a poacher. And give them ownership of that. And provide ways that they can live on their lands and not be marginalized in an area that is not productive. And that's what's happened to most indigenous peoples on all the continents. Is nature a mere construct? Is it real? Those are the issues, the real issues that academics are arguing about. Then we have the papal doctrine of terra nullius, which the Australian Supreme Court overturned in 1994, but we have yet to do that in Canada and the US, although Canada in the Delgamuukw decision in 96 recognized the oral tradition as valid in a court of law. The US has not done that yet. And that has to do with the treaty rights negotiations going on in British Columbia, mostly, and some in Ontario. The Judeo-Christian Islamic view of the separation of the devil who rules the wilderness and God who rules paradise, these are concepts not consciously held by people today, but they, through the cultural conditioning, unconsciously, unseen and unheard, influence us. It's the questions we don't ask that our cultural conditioning addresses. Science is a powerful analytical tool, powerful methodology, quantitative methodology that is important and needs to be integrated with with traditional ecological knowledge. But it doesn't raise the kinds of questions we need to raise unless we step out of the cultural box that we're in. And then we can use those quantitative tools to form hypotheses, replicate them, and explain things quantitatively. Indian management and Indian spirituality in North America, when Europeans first came, was virtually invisible. People did not see it. And if you don't read ethnography and you don't read about what Indian people did, then you're not in a position very well to say one way or the other whether they affected the land or not. Western imperialism is another factor in this. Europeans and the social Darwinian idea, not Darwin's, but the social Darwinian idea that followed him, of the inferiority of indigenous peoples in the scale of evolution from primitivism to barbarism to civilization, is another factor. And the white man's burden, I know you've heard about that, that was their mandate by God to bring indigenous peoples up to the high standards of European civilization. They used to say in Congress in the US in the 19th century, you have to kill the Indian to save the man. Assimilation. And that's been the policy by and large ever since. Manifest destiny. God gave this land to Europeans. Terra nullius actually was based on St. Thomas Aquinas' idea of the labor theory of value, echoed by and made valid by John Locke, the English philosopher, that if you work the land, you have a right to it, and if you don't work the land, you don't. And because people did not see how indigenous peoples managed their land with fire and other means, then they obviously weren't bringing that land up to a God-given right to make it productive. And because there was only one chosen people by God, there could be only one way to relate to the land. There couldn't be a second way. All of these things are quite unconscious, but all of them have been factors in bringing about this incredible cultural blind spot in ignoring indigenous people's contributions. It's an example of conservation ethics of a different kind. We call them taboos. There were 9 types, 7 here. As you can see, I'm not going to go through all of them, but there were very finessed and sophisticated approaches to whether to harvest, what kind of gear to use, when to do it. And we had knowledge specialists who understood how to go about fishing or hunting. If you had a chemist's medal and it was a wet year, the knowledge specialist would tell you, well, let's take every 6 or 7 chemists corm. If it was a dry year, let's take every 15 or 16. 1 out of every 15 or 16 corms. It was very precise, still is, in all parts of the world where these traditional practices still obtain a very precise business. It was not unconscious. Land tenure, I mentioned earlier, was the key to the whole system. You were responsible for your own turf. We have the tragedy of the commons, and that's because the commons in England during the enclosure time, 17th century, nobody had responsibility for anything. Therefore, it was overused and so on. dependence on high diversity of plant and animal species, entire watersheds and drainages included within tribal territories, intermarriage between bands and tribes. So when your oak crop failed or pine nut crop failed, you could trade with people you were related to. They could help you in times of need, and so on. Trading networks, redistribution of wealth like potlatch, and birth control measures. Now, I'm going to wrap this up because I won't have time to go through all the other slides that I'd like to, PowerPoint frames. But I want to talk about kincentricity briefly. We tend to divide the world up into a biocentric approach or an anthropocentric approach. I coined the word kincentric. It's not in the dictionary. It's now in some of the scientific literature because we needed a way to explain the spiritual obligations that human beings have to the natural world. It's a covenant, it's a compact between the animals and plants and the human beings, such that we have responsibilities even as we have privileges to harvest the plants and animals. And if we forget that, the fish are not going to come back, the caribou are not going to come back, and that's actually happened in a number of cases I'm aware of. And at one time in the fur trade, when Indian people nearly exterminated fur-bearing mammals in the northeast of North America, they thought the animals had turned against them. And there, because of the Jesuit influence, there was a despiritualization of the people. They lost their way. And they over-harvested the beaver and the mink and the marten and the muskrat and so on. They got back on their feet finally, and those animals came back. The market economy made them dependent. They go on credit, just like happens now all over the world. Liquor and credit. Got hooked on that, and so on. But they violated their own ethics, and they finally got that back. I think the take-home message I'd like to leave you with is this. Science has developed over the centuries in the West by learning from people that work with their hands, that work in the soil, that work with animals and plants. It's developed because it's been in touch with the source, the local experiences of people that have given ideas to scientists, and they've taken those ideas, they've quantified them, they ran with them, and we have the development of Western science that way. In the university academic system, we have this other kind of disconnect between people that work in the field and people that do the mathematical modeling. That's where the status is, that's where the money is, or in the laboratory. So we're missing field naturalists, good field ecologists. Same idea. We need to reconnect those two spheres because more and more we're coming from up here and less from the heart and from our hands, the actual experience. And this is not good for the future development of Western science. And it's not good for the survival of indigenous peoples at all. So the kincentricity concept is one which says that we are relatives, we are relations, and that we have mutual obligations to one another. Now I'm going to stop here for the time being and entertain any questions or statements that you might have. Yes.
I just want to share two parallelisms or two examples that I think are also relevant to what we have just presented. One, like I've worked with tigers in several countries, and we look at where we find tigers at the moment. It's a global phenomenon, right? It's across all its range in different countries. You find that where tigers are doing well at this point is also where you have indigenous populations, indigenous human populations. Be it in the Russian Far East, you have the Udige and the traditional people there.
Beijing Basin, the Udige people in the far east of Russia you're talking about. Yeah, I've worked with that tribe.
Whether it's in Malacca or Malaysia, you have the Orang Asli. In India, some of the best tiger habitats are again places where you find the Gonds or the Liger tribals who are again themselves quite endangered actually. It's an interesting correlation. I mean, I don't think there has been any study done, as to try to find out, what factors were important in bringing this coincidence. But I think it's an interesting global phenomenon. It's an interesting phenomenon that spans a large area. But also a small example, going back to where I come from. I come from Bhutan. It's a very small country in the Himalayas. Sometimes I think it may not necessarily be an imposition by the powers that be, but maybe just the economic situation that dictate how you lose cultural diversity or how cultural diversity changes. A very small example: rice cookers.
Who?
Rice cookers.
Rice cookers?
Very simple equipment that makes cooking rice very easy. Before the advent of that, like in my country, for instance, different pockets of the country would have different diets. The higher altitude, at higher elevations, you would find people growing buckwheat or barley and things like that. And maybe at slightly lower elevations, you would find people growing rice. But now, like, for instance, just because of economic changing economic conditions, you have electricity, you have access to markets, you have rice cookers. Therefore, cooking rice is very easy. And it's very convenient in terms of time and all that. And slowly we're also seeing that the loss in agricultural diversity, the crops that people grow. So we're losing these pockets of very different or diverse agricultural crops.
The varieties of rice.
Right. So sometimes it's not necessarily any intentional effort, but rather just changing economic, changing times, economic conditions that lead to the loss of cultural diversity.
For the radio, the question basically started out with the observation that in many areas of the world, not just imposition by nation states or World Bank policies and so on are responsible for the loss of biodiversity or the loss of indigenous practices or indigenous crop varieties, but also the way that globalization economic systems have changed people's lives, so they're no longer saving the seeds. And one reason they're no longer saving the seeds, I'm adding this, is because, and this is now happening in Afghanistan and Iraq in addition to many other countries, U.S. patent people have already been over to Iran and to Afghanistan and Iraq, and they've made sure that no longer can farmers share their seeds because Monsanto and other companies have taken out patents on crop varieties, and that the people then must buy those seeds from the company rather than plant their own selected varieties. The problem is that people share seeds widely. It's much like videos. It's a big problem with intellectual property rights now in the corporate world. People share music, computer information. They share seeds. And that means it's very difficult to, in principle, to try to patent a particular variety because it's constantly genetically in flux. And yet they've tried to do that. And that's one area of imposition that I would reply to you on that has been a significant impact, negative impact on indigenous crop systems. And we deal now with trying to get back heirloom seeds like Native Seed Search, for example, in the greater Southwest, and Seed Savers in the United States and other organizations that are trying to bring back these heirloom seeds because we've lost so many varieties. And not just because of the changing economic system either. It's also been because some of the traditional people have simply given up on saving them for a variety of reasons. They're not being saved like they used to be saved. And it's a subtle, slow process, but it's been happening for a long time. And we're trying to reverse that, and that relates to diet, so nutrition. You need to have that variety of plants, you know, not monocultures. I'm thinking about the Chipko movement in India and Vandana Shiva, you know, resisting eucalyptus and Monterey pine plantations, or Wangari Maathai in Kenya and the Green Belt movement, where they're resisting the efforts of Kenya, you know, to basically allow unbridled timber harvesting in reserves in some places in uplands in Kenya, and removing the people, and then that destroys, as in India and other places, the credible diversity of plants that people depend on in forest ecosystems. That people actually, in some places in the world, live in reserves, biosphere reserves, where they're able to practice their traditional harvesting. That's being all lost because of the imposition of monocultures that generate the hard currency to pay back the debts. That's a very serious problem. Thank you for that observation, that I know that Udige people. I'm blinded. Back there, yes.
Thank you. You made a strong case for Western ecological science to pay attention to the wisdom of indigenous peoples, but isn't there a need for checks and balances here, as there is in so many areas? And you mentioned the fact that the Anasazi destroyed their own culture by destroying the trees that they were dependent upon, and the Maya apparently also destroyed much of their own society through ecological mismanagement.
No, I didn't say that.
Well, maybe you didn't.
But I'll explain when you finish, okay.
You mentioned
I mentioned them, yes.
the collapse of those societies.
Yes, yes.
And don't we have a need in both directions for both Western ecological science to listen to the knowledge that the indigenous peoples have to offer, but also the indigenous peoples need Western ecological science, and we need to prevent disasters from happening. And if both sides can share with and listen to the other, we could prevent some of those ecological disasters from happening that happened so frequently in the past.
It's a good point. We need to work together. The question was the observation I made that some indigenous civilizations, and we're talking about at the empire level, not the smaller bands and hunter-gatherer groups that we usually think of as being a little more conservative, such as the Maya, with their loss of a lot of the sustainability of their practices. You know, the practice became unsustainable. Or the Anasazi, who may have harvested too many trees and therefore had to go too far afield to keep getting timber to build. Shouldn't we learn lessons from that? And shouldn't, just as Western ecological science needs to learn from the wisdom of indigenous peoples, so also indigenous peoples need to learn from Western science. And there's two things I would say in reply to that. One is, in the case of the Anasazi, you had incredibly big, long drought coupled with an overextension of their economic system. So you had, as Joseph Tainter has argued, and I recommend the book in addition to Jared Diamond, read Jared Diamond and read Joseph Tainter, The Collapse of Complex Societies. You need both to get a full view. You had a situation where diminishing marginal returns set in because of overextension. And that happened especially with the Maya. And it happened based on a lot of military expenditures they really couldn't afford as they began to, and the Aztecs were the same way, began to conquer their neighbors. This created a downward spiral that eventually reached a tipping point where they could no longer operate sustainably within their environments. But it's important to realize too that in doing so, they left their traditional values when there were less of an empire and more of different bands working in separate local areas. And what we're saying is a lot of the set-asides, this is point 2, that are going on in the world in conservation biology are by no means affecting complex indigenous societies. Rather, they're affecting some very small-scale groups who depend on a wide variety of resources to sustain their economies. And that's a different kind of Indian or a different kind of indigenous person. So, and with respect to the megafauna extinctions, I should add, the evidence is ambiguous, and that you probably had, if it did happen, a situation where drought was changing the habitat of mastodons and many other large mammals, such that a 2% take, according to one UK modeler, 2% only, if people didn't know what was happening with that long-term climate change, would push the mastodons over to extinction. Only 2% take of the population a year. So in other words, you have a situation like now where indigenous peoples are facing global climate change that's severely, especially in the Arctic, impacting their communities, but they no longer can rely on traditional methods of determining the long-term effects of that, nor can they determine how to predict weather patterns any longer. So this is what happens when people are in a long-term change situation. I believe that's what happened with both the Anasazi and with especially with the Paleo Indians here.
One more.
Yes, I wish there were more time.
I'm wondering about the relationship between human population and these sorts of
Well, it's instructive to note that in India, in some places where you have biological hotspots and tigers still surviving, you have over 300 people per square kilometer. Population growth is an important issue that needs to be addressed. So is consumption by the West. But where your values are intact, you can still live with animals, wild animals, tigers, and so on. Where you've lost it, you're not able to do that anymore. It all depends on maintaining those traditional values. Second point about population and the environment is that, and this is a point that Paul Ehrlich, who's known for his studies in population growth, makes. He's also an ornithologist from Stanford. And the only person I've heard make this point, at least on NPR and other media, is the illegal immigration problem from Mexico is mostly because of two things. One is the Green Revolution, which exported biotechnology to all parts of the third world, which forced people, 40% of Mexicans were corn growers, forced them off their lands, and the gutting, number 2, of Article 28 of the Mexican Constitution, which guaranteed the integrity of ejidos, communal Indian lands that were fought for in the Mexican Revolution, that 1 million people died for under pressure from the US. On the Salinas government did this. This has allowed the sale of those lands, and that happened here in 1887 with the Dawes, or Land Allotment Act, when people then could sell their lands to often lawyers who simply took their money and went. And they didn't know about taxes, and they lost a lot of land, and anything over the allotment, 160 acres and a mule, was, quote, surplus lands that were given to non-Indians. So that how the land tenure system works is an extremely critical point in sustainability, even at high population levels. We're experiencing, and this was predicted by Mexican economists in the 1990s, an incredible influx of immigrants from Mexico, mostly illegal, because they no longer have an economic base because of the changes in land tenure and because of the changes in how what people are growing on their land. You've got subsidies on US corn, for example, here, that amount to so close to $200 a metric ton, and Mexico has no subsidies for their corn growers. So with NAFTA, what you have is cheaper tortillas in Mexico, but inability to compete with the US in corn. So these are large factors that contribute to the kinds of population problems that we have all over the world. But yes, population is something that is critical to address. Yes?
And the word for paradise, we use jannah. Jannah means a garden, orchard. So, secondly, I would like to ask a question. I work with indigenous people in Pakistan, Kalash communities. And what happens that people come to just see them and see their traditions, practices, and I felt that it is just they are like sort of a living museum. So when we understand that humanity has evolved from hunting and gathering society to now urbanized people. So what do you think that still there should be some line? These are not subspecies. Indigenous people are not separate from urbanized people. So how do you think?
Indigenous people are not separate from what? I didn't catch that.
From the urbanized people?
Organized?
Urbanized.
Urbanized, okay, sorry. They're not separated.
They are not separate. They are the one and the same thing. And
Yes, they can be. They can be, yes.
there are same issues which has been confronted by all of us.
Yes.
So how to make together a case? Because it's no more that people can live along for the hunting and gathering society as such. People have been living. But if we still want them just to have fun of them and we just go and see them, that they wear these clothes or they don't wear these clothes. I went to Africa just to see Zulu people and all this. I didn't like that. I said, why? They are human beings. They are just like me. So what's the case you are making? I am still not clear that is there any line between urbanized people and the indigenous people? What do you think?
For the radio, he was raising the issue, first of all, that in Islam, Allah rules over everything. Where does the devil live, by the way, before I go on?
Huh?
Where does the devil live?
Devil lives everywhere.
Okay, both live everywhere. But God is in control. Allah is in control of everything.
He is in control of that.
The devil is not in control. Okay. The second point you made was the one about, in many countries, such as in Pakistan, you're an indigenous person from Pakistan. And so therefore, you could live in a city and be an indigenous person. And why do we need to go see people that dress differently than us and so on? It's kind of like a museum piece. When we're all basically human beings and so on. Well, at one level we are, absolutely. But in many areas of the world, including in Pakistan, and especially in India, they are recognized indigenous people by the state who are considered minorities. I don't use the word minority because it implies that the reference point is the nation state. These are nations, in my opinion, within nations. Okay? So it's important then that they be given that sovereignty to govern themselves, to live as they have always lived, to speak the language that they know, to keep their identity, to keep the sacred geography of all the places they live in. I know from the case in India in particular, and I've also talked with Pakistani indigenous people, that they have an incredible knowledge of the plants and animals. You wouldn't believe it. Nothing here exists like there. It will blow you away to listen to them tell their stories about the plants and animals. The subtlety, the finesse is incredible. When we lose that, those minorities, when we lose those people due to assimilation policies of nation states, where it's considered inferior to be an uncivilized person, or a person who's not a Christian, or a person who's not a Muslim, or not a Jew, okay? Then we have a problem of losing cultural diversity and biological diversity at the same time. That was the point that I was trying to make, the case I was trying to make. Okay.